Okay, well, I think I'll probably just get started as people are joining the seminar. Welcome to everyone who's joining the Global Media Policy Seminar Series. This is an online seminar series jointly organized between the program in Comparative Media Law and Policy, that's PCMLP, which you should see on the slide here. And also the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. So this series features insights on pressing issues related to new media and human rights, particularly at the margins. And since even before COVID-19 forced us all online, we've been hosting live stream talks to help bridge the gap between conversations happening in the global north and the global south on pressing and cutting edge media issues. So we hope that you will continue to join us for future seminars, and you can sign up by visiting the PCMLP website, which I will put up here in just a second. Or of course you can tune in live on YouTube. We are live streaming this seminar right now at PCMLP Oxford, and that is also should be displayed on your screen now. Today, we will be taking questions here on Zoom, so please use the Q&A function that's available in your Zoom window if you're attending on Zoom. And if you're watching the live stream on YouTube, please just tweet your questions to us at Oxford Media Law, which should be displayed on the screen now for you. All right, I will stop sharing my screen now. And I will just briefly introduce myself and our guest speaker today. So I'm Kira Allman. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in media law and policy at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Oxford. And I am delighted to be introducing our guest speaker today, Corinne Cath-Speth. Messed that up, didn't I? Corinne Cath-Speth. It's wonderful to have you with us, Corinne. Corinne is a doctoral student at the Oxford Internet Institute. As a cultural anthropologist, she applies the tools of anthropology to the study of internet governance, in particular the culture of the often opaque organizations that enable the technical functioning of the internet. Within that context, she focuses on the participation of human rights and civil liberties NGOs that are aiming to change computer code instead of legal code to affect social change. So with that brief introduction, I will hand it over to Corinne for her talk. And when Corinne's talk is finished, as I mentioned, we'll move into the Q&A. So thank you, Corinne.
Thank you so much. Let me start off by seeing if I can share my screen so folks can see my PowerPoint. Let's see. That seems to be working. All right. Here we go. Thank you so much first, Kira, Dr. Allman, and the program in Comparative Media Law and Policy at Oxford to invite me to give this remote talk today. I want to start my talk by acknowledging that this is, for many of us, an anxiety-filled day, especially for those committed to racial justice, equitable access to healthcare, migration advocacy, and human rights. So I want to take this moment to thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules to zoom in for this talk today. The importance of this moment in time is not lost on me now, as it wasn't 4 years ago when I started my PhD research on human rights advocacy in internet governance. As my foray into academia, or really I should say my return to academia, coincided with the presidency of Donald Trump. Now at the time, in November 2016, which seems like a lifetime ago, many of my friends and colleagues working for NGOs worried about the shrinking space for civil society and what it meant for their ability to affect change by lobbying governments and adopting legal codes and regulations. Instead, some of them started either focusing on or doubling down on their efforts to change computer code and improve corporate social responsibility. And what I'm going to do in this talk is outline some of the promises and the perils of those efforts, specifically within the context of internet governance. Before I do so, a quick introduction. As Kira already mentioned, my name is Corinne. I'm a PhD candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute. Hopefully, I will be finishing my PhD early next year, fingers crossed. Previously, I worked for a human rights NGO based out of London named Article 19, where I worked on their digital team. And before that, I worked as a policy advisor for the US House of Representatives. As mentioned, my doctoral research is an ethnographic case study of human rights interventions within internet governance. And the work that I've been doing has been generously supported by the Ford Foundation and the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and AI. So a couple of words about what I will be doing in today's talk. I'm roughly going to start with a little bit of an introduction, a scene setting to internet governance and to what it means to be doing human rights advocacy within that. I will be identifying some of the cultural and social hurdles that I saw through my research, and then move to a discussion where I hope to further elaborate on all of these various issues with you, because that's obviously the most important and interesting part of today's talk. To do so, I want to start off by talking about the invisible internet, because to tell the story of human rights advocacy in internet governance, I need to talk a little bit about the internet's invisible infrastructure. This infrastructure is maintained by companies that are not household names. They are run by individuals that Susanne van Geuns and I, another PhD student at the University of Toronto, have dubbed the internet's reluctant sheriffs. In a recent piece for the Brookings Institute, we elaborate on this idea, and I will draw heavily from that piece as well as my PhD work for the talk that I'm giving here today. I also want to give a quick content warning. I will be discussing a number of recent mass shootings in the US and their implications with internet governance. Internet company Cloudflare is relatively unknown, but it's a crucial part of the internet. It provides daily services to millions of websites, keeping their content online and easily accessible, including a messaging board called 8chan. And this messaging board is very popular among right-wing extremists. One of those extremists announced his intention to undertake a mass shooting. And in August 2019, he killed 23 individuals in El Paso, Texas. The El Paso Killer announced his act on this particular messaging board because he knew he would be celebrated for it there. Initially, Cloudflare did not see an argument in favor of cutting their services, the services that they provided to this messaging board. But one day later, the company changed their minds, with Cloudflare CEO Matthew Prince writing that the messaging board had proven itself to be a cesspool of hate, and that his company would no longer be providing it with infrastructural support, essentially wiping it off the internet, at least for a little while. The problem with this particular intervention is that the vacillating personal standpoints of CEOs is a really unstable foundation for conversations about human rights online. Because what happens is that you get situations when only a real life death merits the discontinuation of a service. And when that happens, these invisible CEOs really reveal themselves to be no better than the old Western sheriffs who intervened at will and only if a murder took place in plain sight. Now, the analogy might be a little bit crude and unfortunate, but it's also accurate because Cloudflare's interventions only make sense in light of a particular vision of the internet as being a frontier for freedom. This vision, which I identify in my PhD as being rooted in liberal notions of freedom, agency, and choice, is an often overlooked barrier to human rights advocacy efforts aimed at internet companies. But before I get to that part of my talk, I want to move slightly back to Cloudflare. What Cloudflare did for the extremist messaging board, as it does for its 19 million other customers, is provide security services to websites and facilitate fast delivery of content to individuals like us. in that process, they actually make decisions on a daily basis about what information is available online. And in explaining his decision to remove his services to HN, CEO Matthew Prince argued that Cloudflare should neither have to make such decisions nor explain them to the public, because in his eyes, Cloudflare has no responsibility because its services are neutral. Prince essentially called Cloudflare a mere conduit. Unlike YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, he wrote, Cloudflare doesn't organize or promote content, and as such, it's an impartial facilitator that cannot and should not be held responsible for online content. In my PhD research, I find that this particular view is really widespread amongst internet companies and engineers. They very often use it to abdicate responsibility by pointing to the neutrality of their services. Cloudflare's decision, however, to pull the plug on certain websites is not in line with the neutrality that they pertain to have. It's also a really poor starting point for addressing the responsibility of internet companies in upholding or violating human rights. Cue the entry of human rights advocates who try to work with these companies to ensure their work is mindful of its political impact and in line with the responsibility and the power they actually wield through their everyday decisions. So where do you go if you're employed by a human rights organization and you want to work on making the internet's infrastructure more human rights respecting? There's several options that you have. You can lobby individual companies. You can join private-public partnerships like the Partnership on AI, or you can, as the advocates at the heart of my PhD research have done, join an internet governance body to work alongside the engineers from companies like Cloudflare, Google, Apple, and Facebook. And what it means is that a lot of your work will look something like the picture you can see on my current slide. It means sitting in meeting rooms of often quite fancy hotels, drinking still coffee, and arguing over the minute technical details of the technology that makes the internet interoperable. Now, to make this a little bit, or the specific organization that I focused on is the Internet Engineering Task Force. This organization was instrumental in developing the internet that we have now all come to rely on. And it continues to play a really crucial role in bringing together invisible internet companies in their shared need for technical interoperability. To make this a little bit more concrete, I want us to think about what it takes for you to go on your phone right now and talk about this tweet about this talk that I'm giving. Or alternatively, if I've already bored you, you've decided to go and watch some Netflix as I'm flapping on in the background. So how that works is Netflix obviously makes the content you're about to watch, which is transported from their servers to your phone via a network run by AT&T or Verizon or whomever your telco company is, routed through routers made by Cisco or Huawei, and depending on your viewing habits, is delivered to you via a content delivery network run by Cloudflare. Now, all of these different steps involve these various companies to speak the same language in order to exchange data from their servers to your phone. And this is where the Internet Engineering Task Force standards and protocols come in. The Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, is a private industry-led internet standardization body. It's been around since '86, developing some of the technologies or standards that enable this exchange of data to happen. They're essentially at the base of the internet as we currently know it, having developed technologies like TCP/IP, the Transmission Control Protocol Internet Protocol, which enables network devices to be able to interconnect and exchange data. This particular organization is also responsible for a number of technologies that have a direct impact on how we communicate with each other through protocols that, for instance, enable chat or video calls like the ones that we are on right now. So the reason why these human rights activists participate within the IETF, and also why I have chosen to study them, why I've chosen to make the IETF my field site, is because it's very difficult to get access to individual companies building the internet's infrastructure. Yet the IETF brings some of the biggest ones together 3 times a year across the globe in a discussion format that is relatively open and accessible to human rights activists, at least in comparison to some of the other standards bodies and internet governance bodies that exist. So what are some of the hurdles that these human rights activists experience once they've joined a body like the IETF? Without going too deep into the technical details of what the IETF does, which obviously I'm very happy to geek out about in the Q&A, I want to focus on some of the hurdles that the human rights advocates face when trying to inject human rights values into engineering discussions. Now, there are the bleedingly obvious ones. Of course, to be able to contribute to a place like that, you need really deep technical know-how. There is a really steep learning curve that comes with learning how to speak fluent internet engineering. And you need a lot of resources to be able to participate. Not just the money to fly to these conferences, to stay in or around the usually quite pricey hotels that tend to serve as the meeting venues, but also in terms of visas. So one of my interlocutors from South Asia remarked that it's really difficult for them to be able to participate because just having to apply for the visa process every single time that a meeting like this happens is very costly, both in terms of time and money. Another perhaps less obvious hurdle is that the engineers are not cultural dopes. They are well aware of human rights, and many of them actually have a deep affinity with at least some of these rights. So it's not, as some of the human rights folks that I worked with had assumed, a question of pure sort of coming there and engaging in human rights education. The work that they ended up needing to do was actually much more about seeking out a deeper realignment of the different economic and social incentives that drive which values are prefaced in invisible infrastructures. Now, there are a number of scholars like Julie Cohen, Laura Denardis, Barbara Franchevik, who've written very beautifully about the role of economic incentives. And so my doctoral work focuses more on the social, political, and cultural barriers to the inclusion of human rights values in standardization. Which brings me to the hurdles that I identified in my work and that I identified earlier in this talk. The earlier mentioned visions that drive the internet's reluctant sheriffs to intervene or not intervene. So it's really a question of also understanding, how do engineers make sense of the internet, and to what extent are human rights advocates able to play with those sense-making processes to be able to sort of introduce human rights values as something that should also fit into that imaginary of the internet. And then able to understand why the human rights advocates struggled so much with having their values included, it's important to give a little bit of an overview of how IETF and participants make sense of the internet, and why their particular vision renders them so reluctant to these particular values. Now, in my research, 4 things kept on coming up. So the engineers talk about their technology in terms of connectivity, permissionless innovation, interoperability, and openness. Now, these 4 might seem incredibly obvious, but the detail is really the devil is really in the detail of what they mean by these various terms and whose norms, knowledge, and worldviews shape their definition. So connectivity was very much seen as being between machines and not between humans. Permissionless innovation was seen as the absence of centralized authority. Interoperability was very much framed as voluntary cooperation, and openness was all about freedom from coercion. When discussing these particular understandings of technology, or in their articulation of these technical functions of internet infrastructure, it was very clear that their understanding was rooted in liberal notions of individual freedom, voluntarism, and choice. That is, the IETF participants understood standards through what I call protocol non-prescriptiveness. And this notion of, we don't prescribe how protocols get used is really crucial in understanding why they were so reluctant to include human rights values within them. There were a lot of tensions between the human rights advocates and the IETF engineers about what standards were and who they were for. Many IETF engineers essentially saw the human rights advocates' aims as imposing requirements on standardization that contravene their culturally situated set of beliefs about the nature of technology. This created friction, and in my academic writing, I described the resulting tension in terms of the IETF's culture of protocol non-prescriptiveness. Now, why does this matter? It matters because just because an organization is open doesn't mean it's welcoming to all participants and values. And these two get conflated, at least in a lot of the academic literature. My research points out that there are various distinct cultural hurdles that civil society face when trying to work with corporations and with code. And I also try to point these out in an effort to include them in civil society's overall advocacy strategies, their fundraising efforts, and their theories of change. So what? I mean, this is the question that's really at the heart of all academic research, right? Like, how does this matter beyond theory? How does it matter beyond my ability to write up my PhD? So I think it matters because as the debate about online human rights will continue to turn to internet infrastructure over the next years, the challenge for us is really to refuse to accept the non-prescriptive imagery as a given, and to argue for internet infrastructures that reflect that, for better or for worse, we are all living online, especially now in the context of COVID-19. Internet infrastructure mediates human rights and cannot be governed by the whims of reluctant share of CEOs who hold infrastructural power. It's, for me at least, not yet clear what the long-term impact is of the human rights advocates that I studied, but the hurdles they experience should not distract academics or activists from asking for corporate responsibility of these invisible companies. In concluding, I want to leave you with a question which I hope can inform our discussion. When internet companies profess a commitment to freedom, we really need to be able to ask what kind of freedom they mean. Is it a freedom from coercion, in which violence does not beget responsibility? Or is it a freedom that arises from consistent and transparent decisions, in which civil society gets an important say? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Corinne, for that wonderful talk. Really thought-provoking. There's a lot in there, I think, that hopefully we can unpack in the Q&A. So just to encourage everybody who is tuning in to send in your questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom window that you've got, or of course to tweet at Oxford Media Law, and we'll try to get to all of your questions in the course of the remaining time that we've got here. But I'll go ahead and start off with a question for you, Corinne, because I really appreciate your provocation at the end about so what, so why does this actually matter? And I think that this is something that we do all face as scholars of the internet who interact with organizations and entities that are actually having a huge impact on the way in which we all experience the online world. And so what do we do beyond studying it? And so I'm wondering if you could give a little bit more expansive a commentary on what you think, based on your experience and your research, might be strategies for increasing the transparency of these invisible actors and these invisible processes that actually make the internet work, and whether there's an argument to be made related to that, we as ordinary everyday users of the internet need to be more aware of organizations like the IETF, and how could we make that happen in a context in which it doesn't probably sound like the most interesting and engaging organization for the average internet user.
Yeah, I'll start with, I'll work backwards on your question. So in terms of ordinary user awareness, I'm always of two minds when I get this question. So on the one hand, I think it is important for individual users to have a basic understanding of the internet and get a sense of just how complex it is. Also to see a little bit of the magic of it, right? It's so incredibly unlikely to have this network that requires so many independent pieces to be able to cooperate to work, right? It's really quite a feat. At the same time, having spent 4 years at the IETF, it's not something I would necessarily recommend anyone to do. This is not something that I touched on in this particular talk, but it's a big part of my PhD research. The IETF's working practices, hail back from its very roots in academic engineering, and they can be, even the IETF will describe them as a little bit rough. These are not necessarily fun or easy places to be if you're a woman. On average, there's 1,000 people at one IETF conference, of whom about 10% are self-identify as women. And I also feel that asking ordinary users to be on top of this puts the onus of the responsibility to make sure things go in accordance with particular societal norms on them. Whereas I think in this case, there should also perhaps be more scrutiny, both through self-regulations of the companies deciding that they'd rather do the right thing than be regulated, or different types of government oversight, at least to get a sense of things are above board here. Now, I'm not saying that that's not the case in the IETF. I do tend to find them sensitive to societal and political discussions about their responsibility. So that's one. And I think in terms of what can we do to make these companies more visible, I think to a certain extent, some of these companies will do it themselves. I use the example of Cloudflare, and I don't want that to be read as me sort of bashing them as opposed to their the others in the market that perform similar services. It's actually Cloudflare in that sense should be congratulated on the fact that they do tend to take really visible positions on this, and they are controversial, but they do look for the limelight in that sense, right? The fact that they are so open about it does mean that they invite the kind of, well, in this case, academic scrutiny that Susanna and I sort of try to present in the piece that we wrote for the Brookings Institute, but also more generally. So I think one of the things that definitely should be done as academics, at least, is write pieces that are accessible to the general public, but also I ended up just sending the piece to Cloudflare. I have some friends who work there, and I was like, listen, I don't know if this is interesting to you. I don't know if it's interesting to your managers, but here you go. And another thing that I found is that there are a lot of NGOs who very actively work on issues arising from the invisible internet. So Privacy International, for instance, has done some really groundbreaking work on data brokers. And I would love to see, that kind of work expanding, because much as I feel that we need to definitely focus on the most visible of internet companies, so the social media, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Googles, etc. there are all of these layers below that in equal measure raise these same questions, but because it's a little bit more technical, it's a little bit more opaque, it's a little bit less, the impact feels less direct, there's less focus on them that I don't think is, and that isn't warranted. They should also be part of this public discussion.
Need to unmute myself. Thank you for answering that question, Corinne. That's great. We've got a couple more questions that have come in. Erica would like to ask, big tech are increasingly co-opting experienced civil society advocates into their public policy divisions globally, something that you've probably observed in some capacity in your anthropological work. So how does this revolving door model impact human rights advocacy efforts?
Thank you so much. It's a great question, and it is obviously something that I've seen a lot. A little bit less sort of at the layer where I do my research. I see this more often, for instance, people going from big NGOs to Facebooks, Twitters, etc. Now, obviously, I can't speak to this academically. I haven't done the research. I'm not 100% sure what the effects are. I can imagine it has multiple effects. I am always a little bit skeptical of people saying, I'm going to go to this company and change it from the inside. Not because I don't believe that people have good intentions and good values, and that's generally what they're interested in doing, but the machinery of these companies make that incredibly hard. Right? They are very much focused on optimizing for clicks, optimizing for advertisements, and the good intentions of one well-willed individual working on policy or working on human rights is unlikely to be able to really change those gears in a fundamental way. That being said, I'm happy to be surprised by someone who can actually make that change. One thing that I've heard people say who've made that choice is that in that sense, it's interesting for them to be on the inside for a while and get a real sense of how the sausage gets made, and subsequently take that knowledge back to civil society to further focus human rights interventions aimed at these different organizations.
Thank you. So we've got another question that has come in from Davina, who is based in India. And Davina asks, sometimes I feel like the language of internet and technology is deliberately complex to obfuscate participation. What can I do to understand and further simplify it for others? I want to engage with it further. I study young people's social media lives, but perhaps you can help direct me to get over my hesitation on this point.
That's such a, I really recognize that feeling. I remember going to the IETF for the first time. It was now 6 years ago, being trained as an anthropologist with, a rudimentary understanding of how the internet works. But once I went to the IETF, I literally felt they were sort of throwing the acronyms at me to make it really, difficult to be able to participate. And interestingly, I've had conversations and I've done interviews with IETF engineers where they don't say, we do this on purpose, the acronyms and etc. But there is a sense of, listen, we don't necessarily want everyone to just show up here and participate, right? We make it a little bit hard to do so, and we require you to be able to use all these well, I don't want to say ancient, but old school tools that the IETF uses, because we want people to make an effort to be able to fit in. So to that extent, that hurdle certainly exists. In terms of books, there's a lot of really great books out there that sort of do Internet 101. It's a little bit weird to be tooting my own horn here, but recently, together with Mallory Nodal, Nielsen Oever, and Ulrike Velig, we published a book called it's an internet book for beginners, where we have all these nice comics included, lots of cats on how the internet works. And that's definitely a place to start. But I'm also happy to send you some more researches, Davina, over email. So feel free to reach out.
Brilliant. Yes, and that's also a good opportunity for me to point out that there are a few links to some suggested readings that Corinne sent over to us ahead of time, and those are all available on the PCMLP website, and they will be up and available after the talk as well. And I will add them to the YouTube video after the fact too. So if you're interested in kind of reading a bit more about any of these topics, definitely check out that very short reading list. It's a good place to start. So our next question comes from Grant, who would like to ask, what do you see as the payoff from calling protocol non-prescriptiveness a culture? How do you understand the meaning of culture there?
That's a very fair question. It's also fun to engage on the academic level. I'm not sure I would call protocol non-prescriptiveness a culture as a whole. I don't think that is helpful, just because the IETF culture is really diverse. It can't be captured by any one concept. I use it in this particular talk because I'm trying to sort of focus both on, or I'm trying to focus on the different audiences that I figured would be in the room here. And so I wanted to focus on this particular social norm as it exists within the IETF. But Grant, you're very right. It's part of a larger sort of whole that makes up IETF culture, which obviously can't be reduced to any one concept that I come up with for my doctoral.
Yeah, I'll actually add something to that question, because I'm kind of curious when we talk about those of us who are social scientists studying the internet, we tend to use these terms like culture and normativity. We think about protocols as being normative in some capacity, and we do make statements that kind of embed technology in more social structures. And that's partially, I think, an attempt to reinforce the idea that technology is socially embedded, it's a social product. And I'm just wondering, in your experience doing fieldwork with the IETF, how much is that language how much does that language resonate with technical protocol designers? Or is that a language that we really just use predominantly in academia and increasingly in the human rights space?
So it resonates. It resonates with IETF engineers. I mean, obviously, I don't show up to a place like that saying, oh, well, please tell me about your socioeconomic imaginaries for the internet, right? That's not a question that anyone should be able to parse, not even an academic. I always try to be really explicit about saying like, oh, tell me about how you see the internet or what it means to your life, or how do you talk to you about your work to others, because I think the answers that I get from those kind of questions are much more useful. That being said, the IETF is a really interesting place because a lot of the engineers, especially the ones that have been there since the beginning, weren't trained as computer scientists or weren't trained in internet engineering, because at the time that wasn't it wasn't an option, right? There weren't a lot of universities that offered those kind of tracks. So I've met IETF engineers who were trained as philosophers, as anthropologists, as sociologists, as lawyers, who ended up, sort of for whatever reason, finding their way to the IETF. So in that sense, they are really broadly oriented, both in their interests and in their vocabulary. And this is also something that came up in my research. In that sense, is like often there is this tendency to paint engineers with a big brush, or with a single brush, to sort of say, or with a single stroke. They don't understand, or they say, oh, but protocols are neutral. And being able to spend so much time in the IETF, I was actually able to sort of go beyond that conversation. Because when issues of human rights arose, these engineers did tend to often say, well, this is not for us. Our stuff is neutral. We don't make political decisions. We are not the protocol police. I got a whole range of mantras that are really obvious. but I noticed at one point there was a bit of a discrepancy between when engineers would say that. So often in public facing big meetings, they would say, we don't do this. This is tricky territory. Our stuff is neutral. But then when I would have one-on-one conversations with them or one-on-one interviews, they would often say, I mean, of course, this stuff is political, but I'm not going to stand in front of a room and just say that out loud because, and this is where it got really interesting for me, because that might invite government scrutiny that we don't want. Because when we start going down that hill, there's no stopping it. Because that is way beyond the mandate of the organization. Because we are not the right ones to be making those decisions. And I think this is really interesting because it does show that these engineers not only, don't actually believe, they don't have a naive belief in the neutrality of their technology. And being able to understand why they do put up that front is really important, both if you're an activist trying to engage these engineers and from an academic perspective to understand theoretically where their resistance to this particular set of values and individuals comes from.
So that's actually a great segue to the next question that we've got here. Your point about to whom the engineers associated with IETF are speaking when they're speaking publicly, and why they might code their language differently depending on the audience that they've got. So the next question comes from, and I apologize if I pronounce anybody's names incorrectly here, but from Teo Kai, who is asking, I'm curious about the focus on engaging corporations versus lobbying states. Is there a specific reason for this, or is engaging corporations part of a broader human rights advocacy in internet governance?
So obviously, I'm most comfortable speaking to this question in terms of internet governance. Obviously, civil society has always engaged both corporations and states, and often in parallel, right? Like, I'm not a believer in this notion of, code is law, and if we only lobby tech companies, then we will be just fine, because if they change things, then we don't need laws or regulations to change. I think that's an absolute fallacy. You need both to be in place. You also need to understand how tech companies employ the law to make certain products or to make the outcomes that they want easier. And this is actually what Julie Cohen's latest book treats in details. Would highly recommend that if you're interested in that particular question. But coming back to your question, Theo Kai, I think in terms of internet governance, because it's such a highly privatized space, and because governments are often seen as sort of not belonging or tricky because they tend to be seen as not having the relevant technical knowledge to sort of do the day-to-day work of maintaining the internet infrastructure, it is an obvious choice for these human rights advocates to focus on corporations. That being said, it's obviously not the only thing they focus on. Like I said, these things tend to happen.
Great. So just a moment ago, you were talking a bit about the fact that we do tend to, especially in social science, kind of, I guess, smear all engineers with the same brush, treat them as though they're all the same. And obviously one of the wonderful things about ethnography and an anthropological approach to these communities is that it helps to unearth some of the diversity within these communities that from the outside look very homogenous. And I think that was a really interesting point that you made. But of course, alongside that, there's clearly a diversity problem in the engineering community in tech. And so I'm just kind of wondering, where are engineers coming from now? So are the coders of today, so the kids going through coding, computer science programs, things like this, dreaming of joining the IETF, is that changing at all? Or is this still something that kind of a lot of different types of people wind up there for various reasons? And related to that, how do we diversify those communities, or how do we encourage people to join them, especially when they're not very well known, as you also pointed out in your talk?
So yeah, again, sort of channeling my interviewees. I remember one guy who had been at the IETF for a very long time, and I asked him exactly this question, right? Because I was also wondering, like, how do you diversify this place? And one of the things that he said is sort of like, listen, when the internet just started, so 30 years ago, and he did not hesitate to remind me to tell me that that was before I was born. He's like, before you were born, we all wanted to be at the IETF and the predecessor of the IETF, because this was the only place, right? The internet used to be this, it was the standards and the protocols. It was only later that all of these different application companies, iterated on that and developed the products that we now all use day to day. And he said, but now things are different. So young up and coming engineers do want to work for the companies that come to the IETF. But they don't necessarily want to go to the IETF itself, right? Because a lot of the interesting work for them, the career-making work, is in the development of applications and not so much in the lower layer protocols. So that's one part of it. And he also said, making standards, because it's become more entangled with the internet's economy, requires more senior people. So I remember another one of my interlocutors telling me, like, listen, you have to see it like this. And he drew from a war analogy, saying, we sent the generals to the IETF to go and, do the shoulder rubbing and do all of the work that needs to be done. And the young people, we sent them elsewhere. We sent them to work within the working groups, or we sent them to work on different products. So that's one part of it. That's sort of the external reason as to why there isn't more of a pool of a more diverse set of engineers into the IETF. There are, of course, also a number of sort of internal cultural reasons. So for one, their working practices are not, as I mentioned, can be a little bit rough. They have an unofficial mantra of, this is a place where loud men talk loudly. Well, that tells you a lot about who is seen as the prototype of an IETF engineer and who is going to be sort of automatically welcomed, and what kind of behavior people are expected to perform, and for whom that's going to be comfortable and for whom that's going to be uncomfortable. So those effects definitely play into it. I've been involved in the IETF with different diversification efforts. I am always hesitant because their focus tends to be on, we don't necessarily need internal change. We just need to find people who are existing good fits. And that makes it really hard to get a more diverse population, right? If you don't see how some of these working practices are an issue or make your organization really uncomfortable, then I'm not sure that any kind of diversification issues on the inside that don't tackle these really structural cultural issues are going to make a difference.
Great, and I think that we should have time for one or two more questions. So the next question that I've got for you is really about this issue of the values that are embedded in the protocols that organizations like IETF are setting for the way in which the internet operates. Could you potentially unpack a little bit more what some of those values are? You mentioned in your talk that in general, there are themes like neutrality and kind of a liberal orientation toward freedom of expression and speech and openness. And these terms are obviously very broad, and they can kind of mask a lot of different inherent value structures. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how internet protocols, the way in which the technologies interact with one another, actually do embed these values.
Right. So I think the way in which they embed these values is, for instance, really visible in how connection happens between different networks. And people are always really surprised when I tell them that a lot of it is based on voluntary and mutual agreement, because there's a mutual benefit to exchanging networks over, packets over networks run by competitors. People say, but isn't there a central authority who regulates all of this? It's like, no, it's because these network operators tend to know each other from going to these meetings. It's because they tend to like each other. It's because there's an economic incentive for them to be able to do this. So that is one example of how this philosophy of voluntarism really is rooted in the way that these protocols work. Another one that I find really interesting is this notion of freedom from coercion. And you see that both in the protocols, in the sense that the IETF, they built this protocol, right? They built this guideline of how you can best use their technology to facilitate interoperability. But if you decide to do it slightly different, they're not going to show up and be like, no, that's not how you're supposed to use this. They'll say, fine, it'll have all of these different problems and you're going to have to deal with that. And that might mean that you don't have access to the full internet, but we're not going to tell you how to do things. And this also makes them really reluctant to do that in any kind of other scenario. It also makes them reluctant to say, oh, you're doing this thing that, is not great for people's privacy, or that's not great for this or that other thing. And we also see that in behavior. I found at least that in some ways the IETF is a little bit out of step with what other open tech cultures can consider to be acceptable behavior. And when I've had conversations with people about that, they say like, well, yeah, but we don't really want to enforce. It's not really our role. So you see the non-prescriptiveness both in how the protocols themselves function, as well as in how the people that build them try to interrelate amongst each other.
Great, yeah, that helps to kind of paint a little bit more detailed a picture of exactly how these protocols work. So I think we've just got time for one more question. And the last question that's come in is, to what extent do IETF engineers see that the structure they have set up encourages certain activity on the internet and discourages other kinds of activity? Do they see a downside to the structure that they've set up?
That's a really good question. It's also a really broad one. The IETF is divided up into many different working groups. And I think that these working groups have different proximities to end users. So some of them build technology that is mainly aimed at facilitating machine-to-machine communications, and some of it is directly used by end users. In my experience, I found that people who work on technology that directly touches on the lives of end users tend to be quite aware of, what kind of practices that facilitates online. But that's a far step removed from them also feeling that they have some sort of responsibility to do that differently, or from them actually feeling that they are empowered to do something about it, right? Because this is another thing where in many ways these kind of, an individual company like Cloudflare can decide to do something different and that has a direct impact. But in a protocol, you are a little bit more removed from the direct impact. So there is a truth also when they say, listen, this is beyond our responsibility and it is beyond our reach. Not always because it's technically beyond their reach, but sometimes because they don't have an economic mandate to be able to say, well, we want to do this differently because it's better for human rights or whatever values you're trying to put forth in the network. But because they say, listen, I came here with a mandate from my boss. This was a decision that was made not here, but in the management section of our company, and I'm just here to execute. Now, I'm not saying that that's a valid reasoning, but those are the kind of logics that you have to contend with if you're a human rights advocate trying to foment change in these sort of opaque spaces and working with these invisible companies.
I actually will just squeeze one more question in now because we have just a couple minutes left. But is there kind of lobbying that happens within IETF? Because the way that you were just describing the dynamic of individuals participating in these working groups kind of makes it sound like, in addition to human rights advocacy, which is obviously happening on a larger scale at this point in these technical communities, there's obviously the presence of private companies and presumably some state presence as well, government presence. And I'm kind of wondering, is it lobbying that's occurring in that space, or how do negotiations about how protocols evolve happen in that space? Surely one contributor is human rights advocates, but there are probably others.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are many others. I think my participants would very much sort of be wary to use the word lobbying, because that's what they tend to associate with governments. It's like, we don't do lobbying, we just do rough consensus and running code. But if you look at the practice of it, obviously a lot of it is, backroom conversations. States are present, not in sort of a formal way, but so for instance, the NSA sends engineers to participate in the IETF, as does GCHQ, as does some commerce departments of different governments. So they're definitely there. But the IETF has this notion of individual participation. And this in part is to sort of at least create this aura of, we are all here as individual engineers, we're not here with a particular political agenda. Now, obviously, again, when I would have conversations with my participants about that, they said, listen, we all know that when this person from Google stands up and says, we need to do it like this, that means something completely different than when this human rights advocate stands up. Because, I mean, who do they really represent, right? Google, that's what, 80% of all of the content that runs across the internet. So if they want it a certain way, that weighs differently. But because of the way the IETF is set up, it's actually really hard to make that explicit, and it's hard to trace those kind of conversations if you're not in the room, because obviously a lot of the working groups are online. You can find all of their minutes, you can find all of the mailing lists. What you cannot find, and what I found to be really important in my research, is, it's the small social things. It's people grabbing a beer together at night. It's the corridor conversations that they have that really make a difference. And this is also something that I've heard a lot of IETF engineers complain about now with COVID, is that they haven't had an in-person meeting, right? And there is something interesting about, these engineers that built the internet being so set on having an in-person meeting, because at the end of the day, that's really what they need to a certain extent to get the work done, in the way that you just described, right? In a way that you can reconcile all of these different interests and still keep this notion of, oh, but it's just technology.
Well, on that very interesting note, I think we will end the seminar there. It just remains for me to thank you once again, Corinne, for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to listen to your talk. And thank you to everyone who joined us live. The recording will be available on YouTube after the fact. And obviously, we welcome any further questions that you have via Twitter. And please do check out the readings that we've posted on the PCMLP website. And we will look forward to seeing you at a future seminar.
Thank you so much for having me again. Bye.
Bye.